Yep, perfect. Hi, everyone. I'm Antoine. I'm the founder and project manager of a new project called Speckle OS. We're developing, in short, we're developing a user interface layer on top of the Polkadot network. I should also say that I co-authored this presentation with our blockchain engineer, Naveen, who unfortunately couldn't make it. But I'll be nonetheless driving us through what the user experience should be in what we call Web3. So I think it's good to start with what we think is wrong with the current web. And to identify this, we can then move on to how we can improve upon the current standard. So currently, service providers on the internet it's a pretty one-sided relationship between the user and the service provider. Users create data on web platforms, and the platform has ultimate say and control over how that data is used and shared within that platform. So the user has very little bargaining power when it comes to their own experience on such platforms. Similarly, data created by the user is not particularly owned by them. They can't take it away and use it in another application. How it's shared and how it's broadcasted is again dependent upon the service provider. And this now ties into the third issue, being ecosystem lock-in. Insofar as data is not interoperable with other applications, and similarly, insofar as the user is unable to control their data, they become locked into an ecosystem driven by a particular company. So you can think of different Google services like Gmail and their social media service. And usually the solution to this, as inconvenient as it is for the user, is for big companies to money hat different applications to provide a more holistic experience for the user. And because of this, data is considered to be in silos, restricted servers behind the restricted servers that the general public can't access, and it becomes a walled garden platform for the user to access. And as a result, if a user wanted to use another platform, their last resort is to recreate the data that they've already created on existing platforms. And so we have an internet filled with repetitive and redundant information. So, but if we really think at the core of what the user wants, they just want to be able to express themselves freely on the internet. But the caveat is that they want to do so conveniently. And it brings to mind a particular quote often attributed to Benjamin Franklin, that those that sacrifice liberty for security get neither. I guess we can kind of extend that rationale to the compromises between convenience and freedom of expression on the internet. Quite often we would quite often the user would be more accepting to lock themselves into a particular platform if it's easier to use than, say, a more open source or a free alternative. So it now comes to the question of what should the user want out of the internet. I think in addition to the previous 2 points, I think convenience is a very important point, and as is free expression. I've said before that the convenience of applications on Web3 should not only match but exceed the convenience offered by existing applications. Otherwise, we wouldn't get any user adoption. But in addition to that, users should also expect to own their data. That means instead of the service provider deciding how that data is used, the user decides how their data is used and accessed by applications. So we flip that relationship around. Additionally, they should expect their data to be secure. I think that's a general expectation nonetheless. And I also come to this point of self-sufficiency, that the user should at all times feel self-sufficient to use the internet. That is to say that they don't feel locked in or dependent on particular service providers to enable them to create information on the internet or access any existing information. So self-sufficiency, I think, is a very big point that users should be cognizant of when using the internet and locating their own dependencies. The last point might be a bit controversial, but constantly we speak of censorship-proof platform, censorship-proof means of creating content and expressing that. I think from a user level, there would still be some expectation of curated content. And so I think if we allow the user to opt into methods of curation in terms of accessing and reading content on the internet, that would be a much more attractive proposition than a free-for-all censorship resistant, not resistant, censorship-proof platform. Although they would also have the option of that censorship-proof platform. So they would have the option of opting into a curated platform or having a completely censorship-free. So now that we've analyzed the existing problems and what the user should expect going forward, we can now structure what our approach will be and how we'll be using the Polkadot network to make that happen. So firstly, I'll be introducing what exactly we're building and what our general goals are for Polkadot network. To give a brief summary, we're still quite a young project, so a lot of what we're building is still in the ideation phase, still in the planning phase, and so what I present might not be exactly definite in our execution and our framework, but it still gives a general idea of where we're thinking and what we think should happen going forward. And then I'll then introduce you to the stack. So if you caught Peter's talk on day one, he introduced us as a layer 5 project. And although the layer 5, the browser level, the client, the user level is our focus, there is still technology that needs to be developed on the underlying levels to enable the user to have a seamless experience over Polkadot. So we'll be looking at decentralized identities and how the user can have what's called a persistent identity over the Polkadot network, and a decentralized access control list. So like I mentioned earlier, flipping the relationship between applications and users to the other side, where the user determines how applications access their data and write that data. I also want to talk a bit on points 3 and 4 about what I call dApp curated registries. So this has more to do with dApp discovery and chain discovery in terms of accessing different applications across Polkadot. And the fourth one is about governance participation. How can we enable and empower the user to understand what governance proposals are up and how they can easily participate and interact with such governance proposals. So. Yep, so as I mentioned, we're a general UX layer, user interface layer on top of Polkadot. Some summaries that we've had when we've told people this is they often say you're like the MetaMask for Polkadot. That might be a helpful starting point, but I think when people say that, it tells me two things. The first one being that MetaMask is seen as the de facto standard for client user interfaces for, say, Ethereum. And secondly, that I think users have, the average user has a very limited understanding as to what interactivity they should expect with Web3 going forward beyond asset management. So it might be a good starting point, but as you'll see, there's a broader scope that we will be looking into developing. I personally consider it as perhaps the user's kind of window or entry point into Web3 as leveraged upon the Polkadot network. And the third one's an interesting one that we've been recently talking about. So you would have heard a lot about Substrate today by Robert and Gavin over the past 2 days. And it's often called the blockchain in a box, quick to deploy, quick to configure as well. And I think, Gavin also demonstrated some UI configurations that could also be made for that for that Substrate chain he deployed. I think it would be good to, at least on our side, to also develop what we call a UI in a box for those Substrate chains, and that are easily configurable for whatever consensus protocol that a Substrate chain chooses to use, and easily configurable to suit those particular user needs. Now, the reason why we're thinking of developing something like this is that although we want a general user interface for the general broader Polkadot network, I think it's safe to say that one size will definitely not fit all. And so I think if we can provide frameworks and configure an easy way to configure a UI for a particular substrate chain, it would be much more beneficial to the ecosystem in tandem with our general one. So we often get the question why we've chosen Polkadot at all to start this project, and I think the short answer is I don't think it would be possible before it, because I think interoperability is a very key part of piecing together different protocols for a general user experience. And personally for me and our team, we think that Polkadot produces or provides the most realistic vision for a multi-chain future, Web3 future. There definitely won't be one chain to win them all or to rule them all. And from my personal experiences working with other smaller dApps, even though they're quite small in scope, many of them did require their own chain to operate effectively. And I think as we go forward, we will have a network full of application-specific chains. And I think Robert touched upon something like this in that we will have specialized chains for specialized purposes. And I think that is how it should be for Web3 at least. Substrate again in quick blockchain deployment is game-changing for this environment, and so we will also be looking into developing our own substrate chain and parachain connected to the Polkadot network. So that makes it easier for us to develop. And also these concepts of on-chain governance and on-chain upgradability are again make it much easier for the user to engage with the new network without having to worry about hard forks and having to worry about upgrading client side to ensure that they're up to date and that there are no missing assets and so on. And of course I could keep going on, but I think you've heard a lot about Polkadot over these past 3 days, so I won't labor the point too much. So these are our broader goals for Speckle and what we want to achieve. Hopefully over the next year and a half. So I think a big one is that we want the user to experience a persistent identity across the network. So instead of fragmenting identities for particular chains and for even particular substrate chains, the user can have one kind of passport to the web, and they can use that consistently with the different substrate chains and different chains connected to Polkadot. Additionally, seamless control and ownership of data. So whatever data is generated through a particular chain, that can be easily accessed and read by other chains, and there will be interoperability between them. And to go back to the more MetaMask-y type features, unified asset management across Polkadot as well would be very helpful. And then easy participation in on-chain governance, which I think I'll elaborate a bit more on towards the end of the presentation. So this is kind of our general ideation of the stack that we're building. So the first two kind of stacks are like the network level. So we'll be building, everything's kind of leveraged on Polkadot is our expectation. We'll be developing our own parachain that will have some protocol level developments that I'll touch on. Oh, actually, that's on the third stack there. So we're going to very similar to ENS. We're looking at creating a naming system that can be used across the Polkadot network, and then we're also looking at something called decentralized access control lists. So very similar to access control lists and how they traditionally work, but kind of a layer between the application and the user, so that the user can determine how their data is stored and accessed. And then on top of that, we'll be developing SDKs, tooling, etc., for developers to use to create their own applications with and in consideration of. And then we'll have means in which users can participate in governance procedures and access data and curated registries. And then the browser is the user interface, the client-side interface, by which the user will be able to access all this underlying technology efficiently. I think for today, I would like to focus particularly on the layer 2 and a bit of the layer 3 aspects of what we're building, which are quite loaded in and of themselves, and it'll give a better understanding of the underlying developments to ensure that the user has a more unified experience over the web. So this is a very summarized overview of layer 2. So as you can see, it starts at the users having a decentralized identity on the network. Whether we create our own solution or we try and integrate existing ones like Jolicom and Newport, that's still something we're looking into. So the user has a decentralized identity. They interact with what we would call a permissions registry that's developed on our parachain, through which they can set permissions as to what dApps can access their mapping registry, which contains, say, hashes of their IPFS data, categorized according to the dApp that's using it, and mapped to their decentralized identity. And assuming that dApp and its particular functions have that permission, they can write to off-chain storage and then store that hash in the user's data registry, mapping registry. And so what that enables is the user to have a collection of hashes categorized according to the dApp and the type of content created, and they can determine how dApps access those hashes and then read that off-chain data, and how it's edited and recorded in the future. And so our hope is that if we separate the data from the application level, that we can then enable greater leeway for interoperability of data, assuming that they use the same schemas to access and write that data. So I'll start with the decentralized identity part of the overview. So again, you would have heard a lot about human readable names replacing addresses, and you can do that through. So ENS is a fantastic example of that, which I think is kind of leading the space in that regard. And of course, some of the ways in which you can do that is very similar to root and subdomain registries. Additionally, through these identities, we would envisage that you can create multi-tiered account permissions. So you can granularize the permissions that you enable dApps to have when writing data, and the particular functions in which that you enable them to use on your behalf. And you can do that through the multi-tiered account permission that kind of moves down, and I'll get into that on the next slide. And then, as I mentioned before, persistent identities, ensuring that the identity works across the entire network and that the user doesn't have to create a separate identity for each chain that they use. And then the DDO mapping registries, so the data objects that we map to the identity in which they create in a registry on our protocol. So this is an overview of the decentralized identity creation flow. So the user sets up a DID in our decentralized identity management client. And then that connects to an on-chain registry on what we anticipate will be our parachain. And that will be mapped to the DDO stored in the IPFS off-chain storage. Similarly, if the user requests to delete that DID, again, they can access it through the DIM client and point that registry to a null value to signal that it has been deleted. This goes more to the multi-tiered account permissions that I was talking about. So as you can see on the right, again, very summarized, that they register a human readable name through the domain and subdomain registry. And then they can specify the permissions that each account can have when accessing the network and accessing particular or dApps or chains across the network. And so the purpose of the multi-tiered account permissions is that you can also use it for, say, multiple users in a DAO to ensure that each person has only particular functions specific to their role within that organization. And then that leads me into what I've called decentralized access control lists. So again, the intention is to empower the user to control the application's permissions and their experience with those applications, and separate the data and application level. And of course, interoperable data, you would have heard a lot about the semantic web, which was talked a lot about on the first day, which has a lot to do with adopting universal schemas to ensure that applications can read data and read data kind of universally, so that the user doesn't feel like they're locked into a particular system. Again, that opens Web3 up to that kind of adoption, but it's again very schema dependent, and I don't think we will try to be pushing a particular standard one way or another, but to facilitate it, I think is still a good step in the right direction. So the general flow is that we would have another registry in which the user defines particular permissions. when the dApp requests to read a particular hash, it would go through this registry. And assuming that the user has enabled them to have these particular permissions, they would then receive that hash as permission. And once they write additional data to, say, IPFS or other off-chain storage, again, assuming they have the permissions, they would then register the new hash on the registry that maps the DID with that hash. And so they've essentially updated the user's storage in a decentralized manner. And so the general idea again is to allow the user again to define at all points in their experience over the new web what permissions applications have, and to revoke those permissions if they feel like that platform or a new platform serves their needs better. So now I've touched briefly upon curated registries. I think we might find more of these in the future in terms of indexing data and discovering data across blockchains in particular. So a lot of existing wallets, before they would list a particular dApp, to be accessed on their wallet, they usually have to submit their dApp in the first place to be approved and then featured on that wallet. I don't think that's an effective means of democratizing the discovery process, and I think it gives wallets and applications too much power to dictate what's discoverable and what isn't. And so our idea is to have a curated registry of dApps, whereby a dApp can register themselves on a registry, and we can democratize the curation process to ensure that the quality of a dApp and its accuracy to what it promises to serve, it can be prioritized by the community. And so the client would then read that registry and then list those dApps and enable them to be discoverable by the user. And then to talk very briefly about governance, I think the biggest concern is ensuring that the general user base is actively participating in governance. And so there are in my opinion, three key ways of doing that. The first being market incentives, and then the second being communication, ensuring the user actually understands the importance of the governance proposal and how they can participate, and then the ease of use of participating. I think in terms of a user experience level, points 2 and 3 are very important for us to handle, ensuring that the user is constantly notified of governance procedures and proposals, and ensuring that they can easily put their opinion into the space to ensure that they are shaping the network in particular. That's it from me. I don't know how much time we have left. If it's a minute or two, if we can take a question or not. 2 minutes? Yeah. Okay, we have 2 minutes, so maybe 1 or 2 questions we can cover. Yes.
So you're talking basically of building an ecosystem of different apps that have different purposes, but all together give this amazing user experience, supposedly.
Yeah, I mean, surely we could create dApps to kind of demonstrate the potential of the interconnectedness, so to speak. But of course, I think our main goal is to ensure that other dApps and other chains on the network can connect and into one seamless experience. So I wouldn't say the onus is entirely on us to do that. We want to facilitate everyone to be able to connect into that.
Okay, that's awesome. So the 2 questions connected to that was, one is, what is the business model for Speckle.is?
Yeah.
You are building ecosystem
Sure.
tools on one side.
Sure.
And on the other side is it a lock-in the best solution for the user, or is it better to have a model or an optionality?
Okay. So I'll answer the first question very quickly. So business model. Business model is truthfully, it's something we're still kind of figuring out. Again, it's quite a young project. And so I think as we speak to more people, that might become a bit more apparent. So I can't elaborate too much on that at this stage. But if I could clarify your question on lock-in, what exactly did you mean by lock-in? If you
In the sense you are giving them one unique solution,
Sure.
while the ecosystem today thrives on differentiation.
Okay. Well, I think our idea is that the protocol levels would be accessible by other clients, so it wouldn't be locked in particularly to the client we use. So I don't know if that answers your question. Our intention is not to lock them into our particular platform. So it's sorry, our intention is not to lock them into our platform. Other clients should be able to read the registries and protocols that we've developed and be able to tap in and use that. Was there a question over here? Yes?
Great presentation. Thanks for sharing the vision. You touched upon at the end a sort of vision for a decentralized curated app store.
Yeah, sure.
I was wondering if you could just
Sure, sure.
You should be accessing. How do they quote unquote install or access an app? That stuff.
Yeah, okay, sure. So I think in terms of how we envisage it will be displayed, I guess it could be very similar to the Play Store and how it's you get the featured apps on the front, except that there's no centralized person, there's no one person or one body determining what those apps are, because then we think that opens it up to kind of unfair and misleading representations to the community, assuming you take a payment on the side or you're incentivized in some way. So our vision is that the client would then read the registry, assuming it's been curated by the community, and display those featured dApps according to how the community's voted their usefulness and serviceability to the user. And then hopefully we could also implement a search function so that the user can also search for keywords, and each dApp can tag keywords in that registry so that they're more discoverable to the end user. Yeah, so I think, no, so I wouldn't say they're installing it. I think it's just a discovery process to discover the app and then perhaps reference them over or link them over to that application's functionality. Thank you very much, guys. Feel free to connect and send us an email if you're interested. And yeah, thank you very much.